Welcome to today's program titled Navigating Government Contracts During Mergers and Acquisitions, Part 3 of our Winning Combinations webinar series. All participants are in listen-only mode. However, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit, a code will be read later in the presentation. Please write this code down as it will not be repeated and is required for the CLE credit request form. During the presentation, you will also see a slide containing a QR code that can be scanned to access and submit your request for CLE credit. You can also find a link to the request form in the connection details email you recently received. Copies of the program's recording and materials will be distributed to all attendees in the days ahead. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker, Amy Hong. Amy, you may begin.
Thanks, Sadie. Welcome everyone, or welcome back to the third part of our micro webinar series for government contractors, Winning Combinations, where we pair our government contracts group with another practice area and we talk about an issue that intersects both practices. So our thought with that is that your legal issues don't fit neatly into one practice area all of the time, so neither should the content that we provide. And part 3 of the series is a fantastic example of an area of the law that crosses over many, many different sub-practices, and that is mergers and acquisitions. And I'm thrilled to be joined by the fabulous Susie Saxman, who co-chairs our M&A practice. She's absolutely a delight to work with, and we were thrilled that she was willing to join us today for this discussion. Before we jump right into navigating government contracts, mergers, and acquisitions, I'm going to give a quick plug for next month's Winning Combinations webinar, which is going to be on minimizing EEOC enforcement risk for government contractors. You're stuck with me again, but I'm going to be joined by Andy Scroggins in our labor and employment group, and we're going to talk about EEOC's focus on discrimination in the construction industry. So if you are a construction contractor, if you otherwise work in an area where you are touching federal dollars, please tune in, make sure that December 10th is on your calendar. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so let's kick off today's discussion. We'll give you some quick background about ourselves and a plug for why you should be listening to what we have to say for the next 28 minutes. So my name is Amy Hong, and I co-chair our government contracts practice group. So a couple of the things that I help clients with are bid protests at the Government Accountability Office and the Court of Federal Claims. So when two companies are fighting over who should have gotten an award, I do a lot of work in that area. I also help with internal investigations and disclosures to the government and government contracts compliance. So helping companies kind of navigate that maze of FAR and DFARS compliance requirements. And all three of those areas kind of tie into the fourth area that I help with, which is helping corporate groups with M&A due diligence in contract novations when there are government contracts involved in an acquisition, whether that is a government contractor purchasing another government contractor, or private equity, or a group or another entity that doesn't hold government contracts itself, but is considering a target that holds government contracts and what that means for the deal. So you might not know it doesn't fit neatly into government contracts, but some of the other areas that I specialize in are federal grant compliance. So maybe you're a company that doesn't contract directly with the government, but if you are a company that works with perhaps state or local entities that are taking federal dollars, kind of what requirements and compliance obligations come with that. I also specialize in the area of Buy American requirements, so domestic sourcing requirements, what you have to buy from the US versus what you can source from foreign entities when you are performing government contracts or federal grants. And then finally, an area that ties in closely with today's topic is small business eligibility. So how you qualify as a small business in the eyes of the federal government and how that might be impacted when you are going through a merger or acquisition. So now I will turn it over to Susie to introduce herself.
Thanks, Amy. I'm Susie Saxman. As Amy said, I co-chair our M&A practice group along with our partner, Andrew Lucano. And while the bulk of what I do is M&A, I'm really a general corporate lawyer at the core. Among the things that we do in M&A, you may start very early planning for an M&A transaction, whether that's an ultimate sale of your business or add-on acquisitions. In the last, probably 5 or so years, we've seen quite a substantial amount of M&A. It's a great way to grow, where growing organically can take forever. It can be a lot cheaper and quicker to build a new product area, to bring on more employees, to expand your reach geographically by simply doing an M&A transaction. So we'll start at the early stage. And if you're a seller, we'll help you prepare. Maybe that there's a little bit of corporate housekeeping, for example. Maybe we take a look and set up an internal, just sort of an informal data room to see what you've got. What is a prospective third party going to see when they look at your information? And then, of course, internal issues relating to ownership, management, and other third parties. There is always some kind of ownership issue. Either there's the shareholder who doesn't agree with everybody else, there's the disaffected member, there are all sorts of issues. And what we try to do is let's find ways to manage those issues so that you can still accomplish your objective. And then, of course, everything related to the actual M&A transaction, tax planning, planning in general for the documentation, everything that's required. And then, as I said, while that may be the bulk of what I do, I'm also outside general counsel to most clients that I work with. So that's everything. I always kind of jokingly say that we're the emergency room. If you call us with an issue, we're going to take care of it. Restructuring, a complaint, commercial contract, employee problem. If we can't help you as the emergency room, practitioner, we'll find somebody else who can. So Amy, let me turn it over to you to go through the agenda.
Sure. So here's what we're going, again, so the whole purpose of this webinar is bite-sized series. So we've only got 30 minutes, so we're going to hit all of these at a high level. But I will say that, Susie and I are happy to answer questions or talk to you offline, because we're just going to kind of hit the highlights of each of these. First, we're going to talk about initial considerations when you are purchasing a government contractor, even though I think these equally apply, as Susie said, if we're representing the seller and kind of what your initial consideration should be, or what the buyer might be thinking about. Next, we're going to talk about some due diligence best practices for government contracts portfolios. I'll give you my take from a government contract standpoint, and then Susie will talk to you about more general due diligence best practices. Then we'll talk about the impact of M&A on existing government contracts and pending opportunities, because of course the number one question we're going to get is, how is this transaction going to impact our business with the government going forward? And then Susie's going to wrap us up by talking about some risk management techniques to mitigate the potential liabilities that we're going to be talking about in the prior sections. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so purchasing a government contractor, or again, considerations if you're perhaps going to be purchased and you own and you have government contracts. So Susie, why don't you start us off with some just initial from your corporate viewpoint, what are some of the initial considerations here?
The number one first consideration in any M&A deal is the tax planning. 100% of the time. There's no transaction that's not the number one issue. You're going to try to determine, what's the net after tax effect of the transaction? What's the tax hit? Is there a more efficient way to do this? What are some of the buyer's needs? So we're going to focus on tax planning. And then the next thing we're going to do is really assess the timetable. We tend to say that time is not your friend. We try to do move M&A along at a fairly close clip. All sorts of things can happen. You can lose a customer. 9/11 can happen. I mean, all sorts of crazy things that are completely outside of your control. So assess the timetable, and then really be thinking about, who are the third parties impacted that I have to deal with and work with, work into my timetable. And then finally, anything we can do to minimize risks to closing and any post-closing contingencies or risk. We want to do everything possible by having a plan to minimize risk at the outset. But really, Amy, why don't you tell us a little bit about, what in particular is a consideration for government contractors?
Yeah, and I will say this is why this series is so great because the things that Susie talked about are not on my radar at all as a government contracts practitioner. But I've got a whole separate set of issues that I'm thinking about from a government contracts perspective. So the first thing that I'm wondering is, what is the scope of the government contracts portfolio here? Is this a target that does nothing but work with the federal government or nothing but work with state and local governments? Or is government contracts a very small part of a largely commercial portfolio? Because those are obviously going to drive other considerations moving forward. They're going to drive the risk profile of the deal. They're going to drive the amount of government contracts due diligence we're going to have. It's going to be consideration for RWI and how much they're going to be considering the government contracts portfolio. So the first thing I'm always doing is kind of giving a questionnaire to try to get a sense of what is the scope of government contracts in terms of dollars, but then also in terms of overall percentage of the portfolio. Another thing that we're always keyed into that sometimes people just on the corporate side aren't always thinking about are organizational conflicts of interest. Now, this is a big area in government contracts because if you have an affiliate company that, for instance, might be helping the government evaluate something or helping the government draft a solicitation, you could be precluding other affiliates from then bidding on that work. And they don't necessarily need to be affiliates in the same industry. So if you're talking about, common ownership, for instance, private equity ownership, but two totally divergent businesses, you still need to be considering the fact that those businesses are affiliated, and is the government going to be considering, organizational conflicts of interest that come from the fact that two affiliate companies might be on, kind of opposite sides of a procurement in terms of one doing the evaluation, or one helping to identify the needs, or one kind of evaluating the products of another. So we want to make sure that somebody is not buying a company that might, because they're doing a very, very small amount of acquisition services work for a government agency, precluding, a lot of other affiliates from that parent company from then bidding on that work, which might be a lot more lucrative than those smaller acquisition services contracts. The other thing, and we're going to talk about this like 4 different times in this program, but small business status eligibility. And we talk about that for a couple of different reasons. One, it's a huge compliance enforcement risk area. These small business rules are easy to get wrong. They're easy to kind of misinterpret. And so we want to make sure that if we're looking at a small business, are they in compliance with small business requirements? And do they actually comply? Are they actually eligible for those small business contracts that they might be bidding on or performing? And then obviously the second question is going to be, how is this acquisition going to impact their small business eligibility moving forward? Are they going to be able to continue to be eligible? A lot of times, if you're getting acquired by a large business or you're getting acquired by a business that owns a lot of other companies, you're going to have affiliation issues where you may no longer qualify as a small business. So if this company looks very profitable, but all of those profits are driven by performance of these set-aside contracts that they might not be eligible for in the future, that's going to be an important consideration. Along with the fact that even if they're currently performing contracts, how are those current contracts going to be impacted by the fact that they might have been bid and awarded as a small business, but now you're not a small business as you're performing them? And that's going to be driven by the type of contract, and there's some very complicated rules from the Small Business Administration about how those current contracts can be performed by a company that started small and now isn't small anymore.
Amy, that's interesting on the OCIs. That really is not frequently on our radar. And it may well be that there are ways that the buyer can structure or restructure their purchasing entity to avoid those. But if you don't deal with that proactively, you get partway down the process and it's like, uh-oh, we have a problem. So, yeah, good to know.
Absolutely, Susie. Yeah, it's definitely an issue that is oftentimes a very solvable problem,
Yeah.
but you have to know about
It's
the
hidden.
problem.
Yeah. You have to go after it. It's not going to jump out at you necessarily.
Exactly. Okay, so we've been talking about these initial considerations, and all of those are going to flow into our next topic, which is best practices as you're doing the due diligence for a government contracts portfolio. So we can go to the next slide. Now, this is just a high level list of some of the areas that I'm looking at when I'm looking at a government contracts portfolio. So one of the things I'm considering are what types of contracts is the target performing? Are they firm fixed price? Are they cost plus contracts that are going to have some additional cost accounting requirements that might apply to them? Are they commercial item contracts, meaning you're providing the same type of services that you provide to a commercial entity and you might have fewer requirements? But that's always the first question that I'm asking, because Susie, you'll have no idea how many times I have a company swear up and down to me that they are not a government contractor. And then we start looking at their contracts and it turns out they are. And the responses I get is, well, but we're only providing commercial services to the government, or well, we're not providing to DoD. And a lot of times it's up to me to kind of break the bad news to someone that they are in fact a government contractor, and we do in fact have to look at all of these different diligence areas. Compliance history and regulatory risks, that's a huge part of what we're looking at. Have you been in compliance with the current FAR and DFARs or whatever agency supplement apply to your current contracts? What do your policies look like? What processes do you have in place? Have you had past disclosures that you've had to make to the government about noncompliance, even if they've been resolved? Do you have, again, the cost accounting systems in place? Cybersecurity requirements are a huge issue. I'm sure that Susie is working with other cybersecurity and data privacy subject matter experts in a deal, but then you have some very specific requirements that might apply to your government contracts that, in particular, if you're dealing with, smaller entities, they just might not be aware of what requirements are applying. Buy American Act and Trade Agreements Act compliance is an area that I often have to review. Do you understand what products, do you understand your supply chain, and do you have kind of the controls in place to ensure that you know where these products are coming from, and do you know even what your requirements are to the government in terms of what products and where, the country of origin of the products that you're supplying and what the requirements for those are. Labor and employment requirements, again, you'll have your standard L&E subject matter experts on the deal, but you might have very specific requirements in terms of OFCCP compliance, certain wage and hour requirements, Service Contract Act requirements that are going to be specific to the government contracts that you're performing. Pending litigation, so do you have ongoing bid protests or claims, or do you have requests for equitable adjustment that are not technically in the litigation phase yet, but might be moving in that direction? Intellectual property rights. There's a very complicated system of data rights for the federal government. It is above my pay grade, but I call my partner Teddy Arnold when we get these complicated data rights issues, and definitely something to consider in terms of what licenses are you obligated to provide maybe your customers or your federal customers based on how the government has assisted you in funding the development of this data. And then finally, we're going to look at past performance. How have you been performing with the government? I'm going to want to see your CPARS ratings and have an understanding of whether your past performance indicates that the government is going to want to continue to contract with you moving forward. This is just a high level overview. There are a lot of detailed requirements. And in fact, the CIFAR Government Contracts Group just came out with the Government Contracts Compliance Handbook, 6th edition. Chapter 18 is all about M&A for government contractors. It gives you a full checklist of all of the questions that we will be asking a government contractor target when we're doing M&A due diligence. And in fact, just to see who is paying attention, if you email me or you message me on LinkedIn during this presentation or after, and you are the first person to do so, saying, I want a copy of this book, I will send you a free copy of the book. So the first person who emails me or messages me on LinkedIn will get a free copy.
Cypher people disqualified.
Cypher people disqualified.
Yeah.
Everybody else is eligible. So again, we only have 30 minutes here, but if you want the book, and if you weren't the first person, I'll at least send you the link to where you can buy it. But
Right.
just a high level overview. But again, that is just from my government contracts perspective. But I know Susie has her whole corporate perspective when it comes to due diligence best practices. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And I just want to be very high level. I mean, obviously, the first thing we have to do, we have to prioritize what are really the key things we've got to look at here. I mean, are we looking at the top 10 customers, the top 10 suppliers? Is there something that is absolutely critical to the buyer? So we've got to be, we've got to be strategic when we're looking at usually a limited period of time to do this. We're not going to be able to turn over every stone. And I think we've got to be practical too. I mean, no client wants to open a blank checkbook and say, oh yeah, do whatever you want and, send me whatever the bill says. That's not practical. So we first do prioritization. We try to get an agreement with the client. We make sure that we're, depending on which side we're on, either helping our client prepare for due diligence, get that stuff at the data in the data room, or we are maybe we hold back some things until later in the process. So we're going to figure out how to manage that. If you are representing a buyer, if you can have access to technology tools to do efficient contract review, that can be great. Kira is a very, very well-known and in parentheses, very expensive, basically AI tool. We've had access to it for about 10 years. It was developed by lawyers in the M&A industry years ago, I think out of Skadden Arps actually, and it's really good. It's not going to be a substitute for human beings to do checking and to exercise judgment and to give instruction, but it is helpful. Also, increasingly in M&A transactions, it is very common for the buyer to obtain rep and warranty insurance. And this has been just a huge advance in efficiently managing M&A transactions and allowing sellers to sort of walk away, to not have a lot of risk exposure after the transaction for things that may come up post-closing that nobody really knew about pre-closing. It didn't come up during a customer has a warranty problem, but they haven't told you until 2 days after closing, that kind of issue. So the thing about the rep and warranty insurance is it does require very substantial due diligence, and you've got to prepare reports. So we've got templates we've got ready to go. Let's populate those. We know what the carriers are looking for and carefully document the diligence review that you can share with them. And then this is the same time that we're going to be thinking of options that we have. If there are risks that are disclosed, it doesn't mean the deal's dead. It may be that you've got to restructure, you've got to try to bifurcate something. There are all sorts of ways to isolate some of the problems. And frankly, there are even other insurance options. There are, tax, environmental, other policies. The carriers have really been progressive in getting things out there to try to help people bridge the gap. Amy, let me turn it back to you because I know we're running a little short on time.
Sure. And so we'll move to the next part of our program, which is the impact of M&A on existing government contracts and pending opportunities. And like I said, this is often the first question I'm going to get is what do we do with the pending proposals that we have out there that we submitted as a target and now we're going to get acquired? And then the second headache, which is what do we do with the contracts that we already have and now we have a different owner or those assets are now owned by a different company? So pending proposals, the first question I'm always going to get is, do we have to tell the awarding agency that we have been acquired or that we're kind of going through an acquisition while a pending proposal is out there? And the high level answer is generally there isn't a notification requirement, but I strongly advise you to notify your agency. And there are some very specific rules at the government that have kind of come out of decisions, protest decisions from the Government Accountability Office about what an agency's obligations are for a pending proposal where the offer is in the process of going through an acquisition, and what the agency has to consider. It's going to depend a little bit on the type of transaction and also the potential impact. Now, this is another freebie that is not limited to one person. My colleague Erica Bakes, who is in our government contracts group and also does a ton of M&A, she and I wrote a very in-depth article a couple years ago that navigates this specific issue of pending proposals and what an agency has to consider in order for that consideration to pass muster for the award. So anybody who emails me can get a copy of that. I'm happy to send that to you. It goes into a lot more detail than I can in the 2 minutes I have here. But the high level answer is it's going to depend on whether this acquisition has an impact on your technical proposal, past performance, or price that you had submitted for that RFP. And if the answer is no, then the agency generally can still make the award to the target that has been acquired by another entity, or the assets have been acquired by another entity. But the magic words are going to be whether the agency considered those impacts and considered those changes and concluded that they would have no impact on the technical approach or price. And if the agency is just assuming that without you having proactively told the agency that, then you're going to run into issues. The next question that we always get are current contracts. So the big differentiator here is whether you have an asset transaction or you have a stock transaction. If you have an asset acquisition, you're going to have to novate your current government contracts to the buyer. And what I know, Susie is a very savvy M&A practitioner and knows this, but I run into M&A practitioners every day who do not realize that novation process can't happen until after the deal is actually done. And Susie, I know that you have some kind of considerations or some thoughts on kind of how you navigate that process. And maybe we'll jump to that because I know we've only got a couple minutes left, but how do you kind of deal with that?
Well, two ways. Number one, try to buy equity, because I want to avoid the novation process if I can. So really consider the structure. There may be a tax consequence to that, and it may affect your price negotiation. So bring it up front. I mean, as a buyer, that's a lot of risk. Unless maybe I'm a well-known government contractor in the same industry with the same governmental units, and I feel I have a higher comfort level, but it really depends. So that's really key. If I've really got to have an asset transaction and we're going to have to go through this post-closing, nerve-wracking period, nerve-wracking for me at least, period of getting the novations, which is really the consent to assignment, then I probably want to set up a transition services agreement that will enter into a closing so that the seller stays intact, continues to sort of own and manage the contract through the novation/assignment, consent to assignment period. And we work it out that it's for the benefit of the buyer and it's at the buyer's cost. And, we'll do whatever we can do to make that pass muster with the governmental agencies so they don't feel that we've tried to do something they haven't approved. So that's where I'll be talking to Amy about, take a look at our transition services agreement and see if we've really addressed these issues properly so the government won't, give us a demerit on that. But the big thing also I mentioned, potential adjustments, where there are risks, what if you don't get an assignment approved? It may be that, one particular contract, that's not a huge issue, but typically you're going to have some sort of a negotiation between the parties and they're going to come up with just a plan to deal with that. Amy, I don't know if we have much time left. Can I do my public service announcement?
Yes, please do.
Okay.
Bonus content.
Okay, I'm a corporate lawyer. Corporate Transparency Act. I know you're thinking, I've never heard of it. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to comply with it. We are begging our clients and people we talk to. It's real. The compliance deadline is coming up at the end of the year. If you're not sure whether or not CTA, the Corporate Transparency Act, applies to you, I urge you to go to fincen.gov. There's a ton of great material there, and it's not that hard to comply. Amy, do you also want to offer up quickly before you sum up our CLE verification code?
Yes, yes, we will. Let's actually, in the interest of time, let's just jump right to the CLE code. Okay, so here is your CLE information. That code is SS7841. Again, SS7841. This is available if you're watching live or if you watch this recording later. I think we are right at our time, so I would like to thank Susie again for joining us today. I learned something new about M&A every time I talk to her. Today was no different. Thank you all for tuning in, and hopefully we see you next month at Winning Combinations Part 4. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.